The story begins with a single cut stone step. Early November 1922, in the baked silence of the Valley of the Kings, Egyptian workmen, hired for yet another digging season, were clearing rubble near the already famous tomb of Ramesses VI. For years they had been shifting sand and broken rock in this valley, following the instructions of a British archaeologist whom many thought was chasing a ghost. On the 4th of November, one of those men scraped away the dust and uncovered the neat edge of a step carved into the bedrock. A second step appeared, then a third. By the time 12 steps had been exposed leading downward, it was clear this was an entrance, and on the plastered doorway at the bottom, fragments of ancient seals from the royal necropolis could just be made out. Howard Carter knew what that might mean. A sealed tomb, apparently intact. He ordered the stairway reburied. Then he went to send a telegram. A valley nearly exhausted. To understand why that simple stone step mattered so much, we have to wind back a little. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings had been dug over for more than a century. Tomb after tomb had been found, of great pharaohs like Seti I and Ramesses II, and almost every one of them had been emptied by ancient thieves long before modern archaeologists arrived. Gold, fine oils, small portable treasures, gone. The walls remained, but the wealth was mostly memory. Yet there were hints that one royal burial was still missing. Earlier excavations had uncovered small caches of objects bearing the name of a little-known pharaoh, a pit filled with jars, textiles, and embalming refuse, and another with fragments of chariot fittings and gold leaf, suggested that somewhere nearby there had once been a proper royal tomb. But no one could find it. Howard Carter, self-taught artist turned archaeologist, became convinced that Tutankhamun's tomb still lay hidden in the valley. Backed by a wealthy British aristocrat, George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, he obtained the concession to excavate there in 1914. The First World War halted most work, but after it ended, Carter returned and began a methodical, almost obsessive search. Season after season, he cleared huge areas of rubble, carefully noting every scrap. Years went by. By 1922, Carnarvon had sunk a small fortune into the project with very little to show for it. Tired and ill, he considered giving up entirely. Carter pleaded for one more season. If nothing turned up, he promised he would pay for the final work himself. Carnarvon, perhaps moved by the sheer stubbornness in front of him, agreed. The last untouched patch of ground lay inconveniently near the path used by tourists visiting Ramesses VI's tomb. It had been left partly for practical reasons, and partly, perhaps, because nobody really believed anything important could still be hidden there. That is where the workmen began digging on the 1st of November 1922. 3 days later, the step appeared. At last have made wonderful discovery. When Carter saw the sealed doorway at the bottom of the newly uncovered staircase, he immediately understood the danger of leaving it exposed. Curious tourists, local diggers, not on his payroll. Opportunistic thieves, all would be drawn like magnets to a mysterious fresh-cut entrance in the Valley of the Kings. So he had the pit carefully refilled and wired his patron in England. His telegram was short, almost brisk, but with a crackle of suppressed excitement. At last have made wonderful discovery in Valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. Carnarvon did not hesitate. He gathered his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, and boarded a ship for Egypt. While he traveled south along the Nile, Carter waited, a waiting that for an archaeologist must have felt like holding his breath for nearly 3 weeks. He inspected what he could, checked his records, and summoned his friend and colleague Arthur Calendar to assist with the work ahead. On the 23rd of November, Carnarvon and Evelyn arrived in Luxor. Only then did Carter order the stairway cleared again. As they dug out the steps completely, 16 in total, the full face of the first doorway emerged. It had clearly been broken through in antiquity and then resealed. The lower part had been rebuilt. On its surface, they could see more clearly the official seals of the necropolis, proof that this was no random hole but a formally protected burial. Behind that door, they found a sloping corridor packed tightly with rubble. Pottery fragments and other debris bore names of various rulers, including Tutankhamun. It was promising, but still not certain. At the end of the passageway, another sealed door waited, this one undisturbed. It was the 26th of November 1922 when Carter knelt at that second doorway with an iron tool and began to chip a small hole near the top left corner. Yes, wonderful things. Later, in his account, Carter would describe the moment with a kind of controlled awe. He made a small opening, pushed in a metal rod to feel for obstacles, then widened the hole enough to fit a candle. At first, the warm air that had been trapped inside for centuries rushed out, causing the candle flame to flicker. Slowly, as his eyes adjusted, the darkness inside the room resolved into shapes. Strange animal forms, statues, furniture, everywhere the glint of gold. Behind him in the narrow corridor, Lord Carnarvon waited. The legend says he asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter later recalled that he managed to reply simply, "Yes, wonderful things." Whether every word of that exchange happened exactly as remembered is almost beside the point. The core truth remains. For the first time in modern history, archaeologists were staring into what appeared to be an almost intact royal burial from ancient Egypt. The room they were looking into would become known as the antechamber. Inside the antechamber, in the cramped glow of lamplight, the antechamber appeared almost chaotic. Gilded couches in the shapes of divine animals were piled with furniture, and chariots, boxers, and chests were stacked haphazardly. Disassembled chariots leaned against the walls. Shrouded statues peered out from the clutter. It looked less like a carefully arranged display and more like a storeroom hastily crammed full in a rush. We now know why. The tomb had been robbed twice in antiquity, probably within months of Tutankhamun's burial. The thieves had likely targeted portable luxuries, costly oils, perfumes, small valuable items. When they were caught or discovered, necropolis officials had rushed to restore some semblance of order, repacking objects in any space they could find and resealing the tomb. That hasty, ancient tiding is precisely what saved so much for Carter to find. From the antechamber, two blocked doorways led onward. One, broken in antiquity, opened onto a smaller side room, later called the annex, a chaotic jumble of provisions, vessels, and ritual items. The other doorway, on the north wall, had been breached by ancient robbers, but then carefully plastered and sealed again. Behind it, Carter suspected, lay the burial chamber itself. But that final space could wait. There was a more immediate problem: how to record and remove thousands of fragile, priceless objects from a tiny rock-cut chamber without destroying them. 10 years in a tomb. The discovery is often told as a single dramatic moment, a hole in the door, a flash of gold, a famous phrase. In reality, what followed was a decade of painstaking, exhausting work. Carter and his team, which crucially included a large number of Egyptian foremen and workers, as well as the photographer Harry Burton, set about the slow process of clearing the tomb. Every object had to be documented, numbered, often stabilized or treated before it could be moved. There were more than 5,000 objects in all, from massive gilded shrines to tiny beads. The cramped chambers were hot, airless, and crowded with equipment. Conservators, improvised supports, splints, and carriers. Burton's photographic work created a visual record so detailed that modern researchers still rely on it to reconstruct the tomb's original arrangement. It is worth pausing here to remember that much of the physical labor, lifting, carrying, the careful passing of fragile objects along human chains, was done by Egyptian workers whose names rarely made the newspapers. In the popular imagination of the time, the discovery was often framed as the triumph of a single British genius. The reality, as with most archaeology, was a collective effort shaped by colonial-era power structures. By mid-February 1923, the antechamber was mostly cleared, and attention turned to the sealed doorway in the north wall, the burial chamber revealed. On the 16th of February 1923, with Egyptian officials and invited guests present, Carter broke through the sealed partition leading to the burial chamber. What they saw was breathtaking. A room almost entirely filled by an enormous set of gilded wooden shrines, nested one inside another like gigantic boxes. Painted scenes of protective deities and sacred texts covered their surfaces. Between two guardian statues at the entrance, the shrines formed a sort of glowing inner house, enclosing the stone sarcophagus at the center. Here, finally, was unmistakable proof that this was indeed the tomb of a pharaoh. Behind another doorway lay a fourth room, later called the treasury, with the great canopic shrine that housed Tutankhamun's embalmed internal organs, more statues, modeled boats, and ritual objects meant to sustain the king in the afterlife. If the antechamber had revealed wealth, the burial chamber and treasury revealed something deeper, a complete, almost textbook example of how an Egyptian king of the 18th dynasty was buried. But the work was far from done. Those shrines had to be dismantled, piece by piece, to reach the sarcophagus. And then there was the matter of the mummy itself. Death, politics, and a so-called curse. Before Carter could press too far ahead, events outside the tomb intruded. On the 5th of April 1923, Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo from complications of an infected mosquito bite, made worse when he cut the bite while shaving. It was a sad, very human event, a man in poor health succumbing to an infection in an era before antibiotics. The newspapers had other ideas. Almost immediately, rumor-mongers began weaving stories of a curse of the pharaoh that had supposedly struck down Carnarvon for daring to disturb Tutankhamun's rest. A short story about a canary and a cobra, a coincidence involving a power outage in Cairo. The normal deaths of various people tangentially linked to the excavation. All of these were spun together into an irresistible myth. It made for gripping copy, and it still lingers in popular culture. But careful studies of the lifespans of those who entered the tomb have shown no mysterious pattern of early death. Carter himself lived until 1939, 17 years after the discovery. At the same time, political changes in Egypt were reshaping who controlled the past. In 1922, the same year the tomb was found, Britain had issued a declaration granting Egypt nominal independence, though with significant strings attached. Antiquities policy, however, fell increasingly under Egyptian authority. Pierre Lecow, director of the Antiquities Service, insisted on stricter oversight of the Tutankhamun excavation, including limits on access and an end to the old system that often granted foreign excavators a share of major finds. Carter, used to greater freedom, bristled. Tensions escalated into a full-blown dispute in 1924 when he temporarily locked the tomb and halted work in protest against what he called impossible restrictions. The Egyptian government annulled Carnarvon's concession. For a time, it looked as though the excavation might pass entirely out of Carter's hands. In the background, Egyptian nationalism was surging. For many Egyptians, seeing foreign archaeologists control access to one of the greatest treasures of their own heritage was intolerable. Other foreign Egyptologists, sympathetic to Carter personally, nonetheless worried that the conflict might damage broader scholarly work in the country. Eventually, after a change in government later in 1924, a compromise was reached. Carter resumed work in January 1925. Crucially, all the tomb's contents were to remain in Egypt, forming the core of what is now one of the world's most famous museum collections. The curse, in the end, was not on those who opened the tomb, but on any simple story that tried to reduce this discovery to treasure and superstition alone. The coffins and the mask. With work resumed, Carter and his team focused on the heart of the burial, the sarcophagus, and the nested coffins within. The stone sarcophagus lid itself was cracked, so lifting it required a complicated system of pulleys and great care. When it was finally raised, those watching saw, beneath a shroud, a large wooden coffin in the shape of a human figure, richly gilded and inlaid. It was the outermost of 3 anthropoid coffins, each fitting inside the other. The innermost coffin was astonishing, made of solid gold weighing around 110 kilograms. Nestled within lay the mummified body of Tutankhamun, covered by layers of fine linen and adorned with jewelry and amulets. Over his face and shoulders rested what would become perhaps the single most iconic object in the history of archaeology. The gold funerary mask, inlaid with lapis lazuli and other semi-precious stones. Today, that mask feels almost overfamiliar, reproduced in books, posters, and souvenirs. In the 1920s, it was a revelation. For the first time, the modern world could look directly at the crafted image that ancient priests believed would serve as the eternal face of a king. Removing the mummy and its wrappings was a painstaking and controversial process, involving softening resins and carefully separating fused layers. Some damage was done, as was common in early 20th century mummy studies, and interpretations of the body's condition led to decades of speculation about whether the king had been murdered. theories that more recent scientific analyses have largely set aside in favor of more prosaic explanations, like disease or accident. By 1932, 10 years after the first step was uncovered, the tomb's clearance was essentially complete. Carter had hoped to publish an exhaustive scholarly report, but he never finished it before his death. The vast archive of notes, drawings, and photographs ultimately found its home in the Griffith Institute at Oxford, where much of it has since been made available to researchers and the public. Shockwaves around the world. While Carter worked in the cramped chambers of KV-62, as Tutankhamun's tomb is known to Egyptologists, the outside world was captivated. Newspapers ran breathless stories about golden treasures. Travel to Egypt became fashionable. Egyptian motifs appeared in jewelry, architecture, fashion, and film. The discovery fed a wave of Egyptomania that swept Europe and America in the 1920s and 30s. From museums, the objects from the tomb were a sensation. Touring exhibitions of Tutankhamun's treasures in the later 20th century drew record crowds, sometimes queued for hours just to catch a brief glimpse of the mask or a golden chariot. For many visitors, it was their first tangible encounter with the sheer craftsmanship and sophistication of New Kingdom Egypt. Yet the discovery's impact was not merely aesthetic or sensational. For Egyptology, as a discipline, Tutankhamun's tomb provided an unprecedented, almost complete snapshot of royal burial practices. Around 1323 BCE, everything from ceremonial beds to board games, from chariots to jars of food, from clothing to weapons, was preserved. Scholars could study not just individual masterpieces, but how they were arranged, what they were made of, how they interconnected in the system of beliefs about death and rebirth. It also sharpened debates that still continue today. Who owns the past? Who gets to excavate, interpret, display, and profit from ancient heritage? Whose labor is remembered and whose is forgotten? A boy king, an obsession, and a legacy. There's an irony at the center of this story that historians often note. Tutankhamun himself was not, by Egyptian standards, an especially important king. He came to the throne as a child during a turbulent religious period, reversed some of his predecessor Akhenaten's more radical reforms, and died in his late teens. His reign was short, his political achievements modest. For centuries after his death, he was a marginal figure, known but not celebrated. What made him world famous was not his life, but the accident of his tomb's preservation. Debris from later construction buried his small tomb's entrance. Builders of another tomb built their huts over it. Thieves came, yes, but were interrupted, and the entrance resealed. The location was forgotten, while the great tombs of more powerful pharaohs were ransacked again and again. Tutankhamun's resting place slept under rubble and workmen's houses for over 3,000 years. So this is also a story about chance and about persistence. About a sickly boy from London who taught himself to draw, fell in love with the art on Egyptian tomb walls, and pursued that fascination across decades of difficulty and professional setbacks. About Egyptian foremen and diggers whose skilled hands actually moved the earth, carried the shrines, and passed each fragile fragment down the line. About a moment in history when empire, nationalism, scholarship, and mass media collided over a stairway in the desert, and about how one small tomb, crammed almost to bursting with wonderful things, has shaped the way millions of people imagine ancient Egypt. In one corner of the archive, there's a photograph I often think of: Carter and an Egyptian assistant bent together over the mummy's coffin, heads close, hands busy at the same task. The image does not erase the inequalities of their world, but it does capture something real. A shared human curiosity, a joint attempt to understand someone who lived and died 3 millennia before. Tutankhamun's discovery may glitter with gold, but its lasting power lies in that quiet, stubborn act of looking into the past and trying to see clearly. A step in the stone, a flickering candle, a glimpse into another world.